What's up, guys? Welcome back to American Nostalgia Garage. I'm Steve. Made a carb video a while back, and people enjoyed it and got some value out of it. So somebody asked me to do a distributor video. So I'm going to do a video on how I install my distributors on all my engines and stuff like that. I'm going to do it on a small block Chevy, but it applies to pretty much everything. In different ways, but it'll apply pretty much to everything. If you want to watch that carburetor how-to video, I'll link it into the video somehow. I have the memory of an 80-year-old man, so I probably will forget. But anyway, let's get started. If you're new to hot rodding and you're not exactly sure what the distributor does and how to install it and stuff, I'm going to show you. That's what this video is for. It's for the beginners. If there's anybody out there that has any corrections to anything I'm about to say, please put it in the comments. So anyway, this is our distributor. On a small block Chevy, it's in the back. Big block Chevy, it's in the back. There's some Ford engines that are in the front. I believe Mopar's in the front too, kind of going off at an angle there. I just happen to like the Chevy stuff, but the Ford stuff is good to go. And the Mopar stuff is good to go. If you're a hot rodder, good to go. Just to start, what the distributor does is it distributes the spark that's being created by the coil on top through all the spark plug wires down to each individual cylinder. This is an 8-cylinder engine, so it has 8 spark plugs, and it gets disseminated, the spark gets disseminated down these spark plug wires down to all the cylinders down there. I know it's very basic, but we're just going to start there. The other thing that the distributor does is it times the spark. By timing, I mean it changes the time at which the spark occurs in the combustion process, specifically on the compression stroke. So if you ever heard anybody say put it at top dead center and change the timing, and if you've ever had a car that didn't run properly or didn't run at all, it could have been due to timing. If the timing is incorrect, the engine might run terrible. It might not run at all. So what do you want your timing to be? Well, your timing is going to be a compiled list of a few things, or a bunch of things. But timing is basically, the idea behind it is to try to get the most efficient, high-performance burn of the air-fuel mixture as possible. So how do we know what timing we want? Some of the dependent factors are going to be like vehicle weight, tire size, gear ratio, even maybe looseness of the torque converter. Now that's getting really deep into it, but really, let's just say weight of the vehicle and RPM. I use the example of a heavy pickup truck sitting at a stoplight, which is going to be a nice big heavy push, a lot of load from a stop, and a little tiny sports car already traveling at highway speeds, which doesn't have a lot of load because it's already moving. Well, why does timing need to be changed? Why isn't it just set at the same thing all the time? Well, that's because it comes down to a little bit of a fuel lesson. When you hear fuel exploding or whatever, when people talk about it and stuff, the fuel is not actually exploding inside the combustion chamber. What's actually happening is the ignition is starting by the spark plug, and the flame front is catching each molecule in line all the way to the other side of the combustion chamber. It's catching each one of those things on fire, and it's blowing a flame front across as it ignites everything else in the combustion chamber, or cylinder, or bore, or whatever. So because it actually takes time, although it's minuscule amounts of time to the eye, it's a lot of time to the engine and the speed that the engine's turning, which is why it's relative to the engine speed. The flame front moves its way gradually across and expands as heat expands inside the chamber, pushes the cylinder down, or pushes a piston down, excuse me. So what we're trying to do with timing is beat that process, because we want the peak cylinder pressure at the most opportune time within reason. There are some issues that we'll have, and I'll touch upon that in a minute. Why you'd want to back it down just a little bit so you don't have the peak cylinder pressure. But basically what we're trying to do is get a high performance, efficient spark that's going to burn the whole combustion chamber air-fuel mixture. And how do we do that? We change the timing so it starts a little bit earlier and has a head start while the piston's coming up at high speed. So typically you want the spark to occur sooner, or the timing to be more advanced when the RPM is a little bit higher, we'll just use RPM and leave everything out for now. And this is all general terms. We'd like the advance to be a little bit higher at higher RPM because the piston's coming up so fast on a compression stroke that we have to start that spark super early in order to kind of catch up with speed with the piston. When the piston's moving slower, let's say at idle or at lower engine speeds, we can have less timing because we aren't racing the piston as much. These are just general terms. I know if there's anybody advanced watching this or that's done this a lot, has any corrections, please throw it down in the comments. But I'm just trying to get the most simplest terms out there so that it's understood. So I mentioned earlier about having too much cylinder pressure. So if you've ever heard terms like knock or pre-ignition, they're actually two different things, but I'll explain them both. Knock is what you hear when people tell you, when everybody says pre-ignition and knock, they usually are talking about knock, which is, or ping or whatever. It's usually when the timing is so far advanced that it's beyond the peak efficiency range, and you're into the range where you're actually, again, going back to our fuels, you're going past the ability of the fuel's ability to stay as a gas without igniting on its own. So every fuel has its own, I think that's called a flash point, which is a point where without an ignition, excuse me, without an ignition source, like a spark plug or a flame, it'll ignite on its own just because it's so hot and the molecules are moving so fast. That's called the flash point. So if we start, if we've already got a high compression engine, which is really getting that fuel air mixture nice and hot when it's crushing it inside the combustion chamber, and then you're adding heat from a flame source, say on this side of the cylinder, and somehow because it got so hot from the flame front and the pressure that over here ignited, and now you have two flame fronts hitting each other, that's what we have when we have knock. That's ping, knock, and that's super dangerous for your engine. It'll blow this thing to pieces. It'll crush piston ring lands. It'll blow pieces off of pistons. It's really dangerous. So we want to basically tune our engine to be up to that point and then back it down just a little bit so it's nice and safe. What's pre-ignition? Pre-ignition is sort of the same thing, except imagine like a cylinder head gasket was too big and it kind of hung into the combustion chamber a little bit, and now you've got that like kindling thing, which is like when you put a stick in the fire and it turns glowing red. It's the same difference, whereas that, let's just say that piece of head gasket gets so hot from being inside of there, and it's just a piece of, sheet metal, and it gets super red hot, and what happens is now you've got like an ignition source somewhere else in the engine that isn't the spark plug, and it can ignite the fuel source also. That's pre-ignition, so they're a little bit different. Alright, I know that that's been a ton of talking, and you're probably bored of me. You've probably skipped through this whole part of the video, but I just kind of wanted to go over those things so that there's an understanding of what we're doing. It's one thing to show you how to put a distributor in and set it up. It's another thing for you to physically understand what's going on, so you know why you're changing things. So I'm going to pull this distributor out. I'll show you how I like to set them in and set them up, and I'll show you some parts and pieces of the distributor as we go. So far, we already know that the timing of this is important. The timing is time of crankshaft rotation. So the crankshaft is down there. It actually spins the camshaft. The camshaft spins the distributor off of a gear that's down on the bottom of the distributor onto a gear that's on the camshaft. And the distributor also has a secondary purpose, which is turning the oil pump. And I'll get to that in a minute because that's important. So what I'm going to do just to prove that the way that I do this works is I'm actually going to take the distributor out. I'm going to spin the engine over so that the timing is completely out. And then I'm going to reinstall it the way I like to do it. And we'll start the engine up with some fuel in the carburetor just to show that it works. Alright, so before I start anything, I'm going to turn the engine over. You can see the distributor is not in the engine. I'll go over that in a minute. Cap's right here. I'm going to turn it so that it's out of time, and then we'll start over. Alright, so the engine is not in time anymore. The distributor is sitting right there. And it isn't going to do us very good right there. So let's go ahead and drop it in. We'll go over some of the anatomy of the distributor. This is the cap. This is where the spark comes from the coil that's on the back. Comes in. It goes through this turning rotor over here and gets distributed to each one of these plates here, which goes to a spark plug, which goes to each one of the spark plug wires in the engine. So the cap is pretty simple. On this type of system, which is an HEI system, HEI stands for high energy ignition, and on these, the coil is actually part of the cap here, which is pretty cool because it's pretty much one of those things you can just kind of drop in and go. You know what you're doing, and it's very simple. It's got 4 hold down clips here. You got your electrical connections all in the side of the cap. Ignition. You've got this is our ignition source going to the module, which is inside. I'll show in a minute. We've got a tach source for a gauge, and we've got ground, which goes to our ignition module down there. And then there's another wire that comes out and grounds the whole thing from this coil down here. So, all right, here's our distributor. Here is the gear that meshes with the camshaft down in there. And what happens is it turns in time with the turning of the crankshaft and camshaft, and it turns this rotor, which is connected. The rotor at some point turns at and points at each one of those plates inside the distributor that I showed you earlier and distributes a spark out. We have a high energy ignition module, which does magic. The coil touches in here, touches right there, sends a spark down to here, and it goes out. If you're wondering what this is, that's a vacuum can. And what that does is it adds vacuum advance during idle and part throttle. And then when you're at wide open throttle, there's no vacuum, so this doesn't add any advance. All right, here's our rotor. I removed it. Here's where our advance comes from. There's these little weights with little springs on here, and as this spins, there's centrifugal force that forces these weights to pull out. Now, when these weights pull out, if you look closely, it's tough. If you look closely, it turns this plate underneath, which is directly connected to the shaft. So as these weights pull out, it actually turns the distributor rotor further forward in its rotation. Anyway, let's throw everything back together, and we'll install it, and I'll show you what I do. This rotor has a mark on it. See, there's a little notch right there. Okay, that notch is going to align with a notch right here, so you can't mess it up. I mean, you could mess it up, and I have messed it up 100 times, but there is a notch on there to avoid that. Now what I've got to do before I do anything is I've got to get the engine to the point of its rotation that I want it to be. So I've got to turn the engine over to the timing that I want this thing to be at idle or startup. So I personally would like this to be at roughly 15 degrees before top dead center at idle. So that's my personal opinion on this. What I will say is that not everybody runs it like that. It could be anywhere from 6, 8 degrees all the way up to 20. If some people run out locked out distributors that don't have any advance in them, and they'll run them at 30 plus degrees at idle. It may be hard to start at that timing because you're kind of fighting the piston. You're igniting it so early that you're fighting the piston as it's coming up. But once it's running, locked out distributors are good for a reason. The way that you really decide how to do this, if you're just leaving everything stock, is you need to know exactly how much advance your advance mechanism is going to add at wide open throttle. Because really the only place that it's really super important or critical to engine life is going to be down at, all the way up at wide open throttle, where you have the least margin for error. So if I have, just use round numbers, if I have 20 degrees of advance in the mechanism, meaning that when my weights that I showed you underneath here spin out, they add 20 degrees. If they add 20 degrees, and I don't want to go past, let's just say 30 degrees, I would start having detonation and ping in the engine, knock in the engine. Let's say that happens, just for example, at 30 degrees. If I know that this is going to add 20, then I would probably want to put my initial timing at like 8. That way I have 8, I'm going to add 20, that puts me at 28. So I have 2 degrees of a buffer before 30 degrees where this would start to ping. Now this won't ping at 30 degrees. This engine is relatively mild. It's not going to ping at 30 degrees, but it might ping at 40 degrees. So if I had 20 degrees in that advanced mechanism, I could probably run up to like 18, even 19 degrees of initial advance or at startup idle and still be safe, because when it adds in that 20, I'll only end up at 39 and ping happens at 40, for example. I know I'm talking a lot. I just want you guys to understand it, that's all. So I know from running that this engine that I want to really kind of be around, like, let's just say 15 degrees initial. So that's what I'm going to set it up at. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn the engine until I reach 15 degrees on the balancer, on the pointer down here. So I'm going to turn the engine until I have 15 degrees before top dead center on the compression stroke on cylinder number 1, which is where all of our timing pointers on Chevys, to my knowledge, are based off of. And then I'm going to drop my distributor in. So let's do that first. There's a couple of ways to make sure that you're at top dead center on the compression stroke on number 1, which is the front cylinder on the driver's side bank on a Chevy. You could take the valve cover off and watch the rockers go up and down and all some funny stuff dancing around, and that's really good. And then you can go back to the pointer and verify. The other easy way is just pull the spark plug out, put your thumb over it. When you start feeling compression, you're on the compression stroke, and then you can just keep turning the engine over until you reach the desired timing on the balancer down there. That's what I'm going to do. What I will tell you is if you're working alone, especially with stuff like this, get one of these guns without it doesn't shoot anything, just shoots electricity down these wires. I'm going to put my finger over the spark plug hole and I'm going to basically feel for air. So I'm going to turn the engine over with this trigger, which I hooked up to the power and S terminal on the starter. Little bumps. Okay, you heard that. So now I know I'm on the compression stroke. Okay, believe it or not, we're actually at about 15. Technically we're at 2, 4, 10. Technically we're at 12. We're at 16 technically. Let me show you. Our 0 is like right here. And 0 is, that's where the timing point, whatever the timing pointer is, this is your reference point. And it's pointing at about 16 degrees before top dead center on the balancer right here. Sorry, pointing the camera at the wrong spot. So we're going to just use 16 as good enough. One consideration I'm going to take when I drop this in is make sure that this vacuum can isn't pointing at a spot where I won't be able to advance it or retard it, meaning turn it forward or turn it backwards. So I'm going to put the vacuum can, there's a little bit of a window in between the back of the carburetor and the firewall. I'm going to place it sort of right in the middle here. Alright, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. I have the distributor where I want it, but it's not going all the way down. It's not going all the way down because the oil pump pickup, which is down that hole, because the oil pump is directly below that, is actually still holding the distributor up. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to just turn the engine over until it meshes with it and the distributor falls down. And you couldn't really see it, but it went down. See? That's it. Now the reason it didn't matter that I just turned it with the distributor still not totally installed was because it was already meshed with the camshaft at that point, which means it was already in time. The only thing that needed to happen was for it to turn and mesh with the distributor drive for the oil pump. So I can actually put my cap back on, make sure all my electrical connections are still connected. I can put my cap back on, my rotor's on. First thing I'm going to do actually is tighten down the distributor so it doesn't turn anymore. A little bit of a tech tip. when you tighten down your distributor hold down bolt, don't crank it on there to a point where you can't turn the distributor, or that if you turn it, it's going to rip the gasket underneath. Just tight enough where it's not going to turn on its own, but you can still turn it by hand with a decent amount of force. Okay, another critical point when you put your cap on is this. I just turned the engine over just to make sure that it's pointing at our #1 tower, or where I want my #1 tower to be. And when I say #1 tower, I mean on this distributor cap. And that's pointing about here. So I'm going to hold my finger just here, just for reference. I'm going to get my cap settled on there. Cap is about there. Now this is going to be our #1 tower, and it's pointing pretty much where I want it to be. All right, I've got to fish out all of our wires here now, which is super fun. I marked all the wires except for one because I couldn't reach it, and they're just all going to go back on the towers that I want them to, or that they came off of. If you're starting from nothing here, then you just got to go through the spark firing order, and for Chevy it's 1-8-4-3-6-5-7-2. My other engine over there has what's called a 4-7 swap, which is supposed to be more about balance and high performance, and that's 1-8-7-3-6-5-4-2. Pretty confusing stuff, but anyway, you know what to do. So we know that this is going to be 1, this is going to be 8, so I'm just going to go through the order. Now we're going to test our whole theory, which is just do a little bit of that, which is just some flammable juice. Give it a start. Obviously we ran out of fuel, but you get the point. It starts. Okay guys, now you got your distributor installed and you're ready to actually tune it and adjust your timing. And this is why I brought up the point about this vacuum can having some space in between the firewall and the manifold. When you're ready to adjust, the way that you adjust these distributors, specifically on this Chevy, the distributor, the rotor inside, which distributes the spark, like I explained earlier, it spins clockwise. So in order to advance the timing, you have to turn the distributor counterclockwise. Now, when we're talking about actually advancing the timing, let me show you what you do. So this is a timing light, and what it is a little light bulb on like this little alien ray gun moonraker looking thing, like James Bond. Gets a power and ground, and then it has an inductive pickup. A lot of these have a arrow on it. You can see that goes, it says towards the plug. And this is an inductive pickup. It goes on the wire. So if this is our #1 spark plug, which we're gonna use that for timing, we'll go around it like that. It'll clamp on. And then what you'll do is you'll take this ray gun and you'll point it down at your balancer, which is down here. And what it does is it creates like an optical illusion. If anybody remembers those little flip books that you did as a kid, where it would be a whole bunch of still images and you'd flip through it and it'd make it look like a cartoon or a movie or something was happening, this is basically that visual effect backwards. This is, it blinks the light every time it gets an inductive electricity probe or inductive pulse through that wire and that inductive pickup. It'll flash the light. And what it does is, if you shine the light down at the balancer here, every time it blinks, you'll just see, for that split second, you'll just see the number that's on there, and it'll be whatever the number is aligned with our timing pointer. That's where the timing is currently. And then, like I said, if you want to add more, you're going to turn this distributor counterclockwise. If you want to decrease it because the timing's too advanced and you want to retard the timing, you're going to turn it counterclockwise. You want to turn it clockwise. So hopefully that helps a little bit with adjusting. All right, well, we ran out of fuel. I'm just dumping it down the carburetor. Point is that the theory behind it works. If you drop the distributor in at a designated point, the engine will be at a good point to start up at. Now, obviously, from there, you'd have to tune it, tuning the distributor. tuning the carburetor, which I have to do both of. But the point is that the whole method of the madness is just to get it to bark off, which it does. Now, I know that's a lot of talking, and it's a lot of theory and stuff like that, but I just wanted to give you guys, you know, a down and dirty, quick way to install the distributor and to understand the way that all this stuff works. So if anybody's got anything that they want to add, or something that they think I said that was wrong or whatever, I'm all ears. Also, listen, I'm always learning too, so if you know something that I don't, drop it down below in the comments. If you did learn something from the video, or you just appreciated the video, or you just enjoyed it, throw me a like. Can't hurt. And please consider subscribing to the channel. It only helps me grow the channel, which is, I'm just trying to grow the channel so I can put out more content to hopefully keep you guys busy on a boring day when it's raining outside, or whatever. Thank you for watching. Check you guys out next time. American Nostalgia Garage, out.